Buenos dias. This presentation of Preterit goes along with Así se dice Spanish 2. So we've been talking in class about el pretérito. We know that that is a very commonly used past tense. Throughout this presentation, you'll also see some artwork by a very famous painter. His name is Francisco de Goya. And very briefly, we'll talk about his paintings because the paintings that he created were a bit like photographs that showed how people of his time lived. So in this one, the wedding, you can see in the middle, the married couple. The man, not so handsome. The princess-to-be, or aristocrat, very beautiful. Her dad arranged this marriage. Her dad's friends are pretty proud of the idea because it keeps wealth in the family. Francisco de Goya paints a painting in which we can see young children who are playing, middle-aged people who are attending the wedding, a little bit older people who are more concerned with business, and toward the end of life, even someone who's almost out of the picture. So as you look at this bridge that spans, the span of a lifetime, this painting tells a lot of stories. So Francisco de Goya, a very famous painter. Here are some facts about his life, and you can see some of his paintings in the Prado Museum in Madrid. And that's where these pictures came from. Okay, back to our study about preterite tense. So we've already worked a bit with the regular preterite. You know that there are regular preterite endings. You know that you have to work with AR endings and ER endings. Something else you know on the next slide is that there are irregulars. And these three verbs we've worked with already in class. They are not conjugated the same way. They are short, and they don't have accent marks. Okay, the background picture, by the way, is the Prado Museum in Madrid. Now we're going to move into talking about groups of verbs that are irregular. We'll look at them in groups, starting with what we call the original 13. That's only because there happen to be 13 common verbs that we use in class. They have to be memorized as irregular. So when I'm looking at this list of verbs, these are verbs that I need for everyday speaking. Estar is really common. Tener, hacer. I mean, these are verbs you need. Querer, okay? Saber. They're verbs that we've been working on already with different things. So now if we want to do them in the preterite, look what happens. The stem changes. This does not follow the regular preterite conjugating rules that we looked at with AR and ER verbs. You actually have to memorize. The estar becomes estuf, and tener becomes tuf. And then there are a few more. There's a little bunch, a little group that actually have a J in the ending of their spelling. So decir is another common verb, and traer, And so as you go through those 13 verbs, you do need to know the meanings of them. So make sure you're putting meanings down as you go, or we'll talk about them in class as we practice with these irregular stems. And we'll talk about what happens with them on the next slide. Before we change, let's take a quick look at another painting by Francisco de Goya that tells a story. This is an assassination story. So the French soldiers, whose guns we can see here, are about to assassinate some of the victims, the innocent citizens of Madrid. His innocence is shown by the fact that he's wearing white. And there's a close-up of the horror, of war, which is one of the statements that Goya is making. And look at the confusion, really, on the faces of the victims. Okay, so back to talking about those verbs with odd stems. Here's the set of endings. These endings are not AR endings. They are not ER and IR endings. It's a third set of endings that we use only with these odd stem verbs, just for those 13. Okay, no accent marks. So now if you go back through those 13, you'll end up with like tuve, tuviste, tuvo, tuvimos, tuviste, tuvieron. And some of you were asking about estuve at one point, estuviste. So that's how it sounds, and they actually do just something you just have to memorize. Okay, we're moving on to another grouping of irregulars. These verbs are stem changing. Okay, and in particular, we're talking now about the IR stem change verbs. We talked about these specially already when we were doing progressive tense. And we talked about how the E in the present participle would turn into an I, or the O in the present participle would turn into a U. So we did things like está durmiendo. That idea is coming back. And remember, I told you if that made sense to you then, you were going to be happy when we worked in the preterit. So there's a group of verbs that are IR stem changers in which the O in the stem will change to U, or the E in the stem will change to an I, but only in the third person. So on the next slide, we'll show you how that conjugates. And you remember the meanings, I hope. Dormir, to sleep. Morir, to die. Pedir, to ask for. Repetir, to repeat. Seguir, to continue or to follow. Servir, to serve. All right, let's talk about this Goya painting. Not so impressive, just a painting of an aristocratic lady called La Maja Vestida, the dressed Maja. So Maja is her title, painted in somewhere in the late 1700s by Francisco de Goya. It was actually commissioned by a very wealthy aristocrat who wanted a portrait of his wife. So when Francisco de Goya started working with her, reportedly painted a naked version, La Maja Desnuda. And when they were working on the painting, of course, the husband wanted to see the progress. So when he came to check up on it, Goya very quickly made a dressed version. So the two paintings, actually, they're hung side by side in the Prado Museum, and you can see either one of them. And the Maja Desnuda was quite a scandal. The first time really that a painter was painting a nude, and so leave it to the Spanish. Okay, so looking back at what happens with those IR stem changing verbs, well, the stem change, like I just kind of said, is only going to appear in the third person. So, for example, preferir is an IR verb. It happens to be an IE stem changer in the present tense. So if I'm going to work with it now as a preterite verb, well, I'll take that stem, I can see it, and I'll work with it until I get to the third person, and that's where I'm going to make a stem change. But just like what happened when we did progressive, it's not a full stem change, it's only an I. And remember, it's always going to be the second vowel when you have these long words. And if I circle, and if I were a better artist like Francisco de Goya, this could look like a ski. That's why I call them ski verbs. So it changes only in third person. So what used to be a boot verb, when we did present tense, is now a ski verb when we're working in the preterite tense. That's your visual. You know how the boot would help? Sometimes we'd say, remember, it's stem changing. You put the stem change inside the shoe or the boot. Well, now we're going to say, all right, it's preterite, but it's stem changing. So we're going to put the stem change only in the bottom, third person forms. And again, you'll get used to the idea, but it is only for IR stem changers. Okay, what else is irregular in the preterite? Oh, whoops. We also have an example of what would happen with a UE stem change IR verb. So if I look at dormir, and conjugate it out, I'm sorry, the durmieron jumped over. The durmieron should be over here. So then you would have the durmió and durmieron, in the third person forms. And again, the reminder that the E becomes I or the O becomes U, but again, only in the third person forms. Okay, another quick painting, very beautiful colors, by Francisco de Goya of workers and actually aristocratic people, not the workers. They're out in the fields, probably checking on the grape harvest and enjoying a little bit of wine in the sunshine, maybe a picnic situation. Anyway, a moment when they stopped to rest. And again, it's almost like looking at, photographs when you look at Goya paintings. Okay, so what else about irregular? As if that wasn't enough. There's also a group that change their spelling. So again, this might be familiar to you because we were talking a lot about the sound of the letter C and the sound of the letter G. And I was saying to you that if it makes sense to you that a C could have a soft sound and a hard sound, same thing with a G, all depending on the spelling, you would be happier once we got into working with preterit. All right, so if we look at these groupings of verbs that end in CAR or GAR or ZAR, we are going to be aware that they're AR verbs, that they're vowel changes are going to affect the pronunciations. So look at sakar. Take away the AR, part that's left is the stem. If I'm trying to do a preterit version of this verb and I put on an accented E, I have not written sake, I've written sase, because a C in front of an E or an I is a soft sound. So I do need to change to a QU spelling to make sakar consistent all the way through. Sake, sakaste, sako, sakamo, sakaste, sakaron. You know, that's all about maintaining the sound. So the C changes to a QU, and that becomes the spelling of the yo form preterit. That's going to happen with yegar because of the G. So if I begin my yegar with this stem and I put on the accented E, I would have to pronounce yehe because a G in front of an E is soft. So look what happens. The U is added in so that that G sound will match the rest of the conjugation. Yege, yegaste, yego. So really there isn't anything to memorize about this group if you're paying attention to spelling rules. Because as soon as you write sase, you know, if you're pronouncing it, or yehe, you would make that quick correction to a QU so that you could write K, sake, or to a GU spelling to keep that hard G sound like we've talked about. This one, empezar, or any verb that ends in ZAR, when you write out the yo form in the preterit, you can't leave a Z in front of an E in Spanish spelling. It just doesn't happen. That has to change to a C. You learned that when you did lapices. So you spelled lapices with a CES, the word pencils, back in Spanish 1. That's going to happen anytime you have a Z coming in front of an E. That just, you know, it's incorrect spelling. Okay, so this group really is known for spelling changes because of the sound. And last but not least, another idea we already talked about. We talked about this with the ER and IR verbs that have two vowels. Those double vowel ER-IR verbs, we don't want so many vowels in a row. Remember the thing about avoiding the three vowels? Maybe think of it as we don't want E-I-E-I-O, you know, old MacDonald had a farm, yeah. Okay, so if I was going to do layer, here's my stem. If I put on the I-O ending or even the I-E-R-O-N ending, I'm having the same issue of this vowel thing that's very hard to pronounce. So the I turns into a Y. That's happening in leyo. And it will happen again when I do the I-E-R-O-N ending because, again, pronouncing three vowels like this in a row, the I becomes the Y. Leyeron. And now that will be true for any verb like these that end up with an ER or an IR verb that end up with, a vowel at the end of the stem. So here, again, is our leyer verb. And this idea of the I to Y is kind of familiar because you were doing it already when we worked with progressive. Another favorite painting of Goya, huh? This is Saturn devouring his son. According to mythology, Saturn was jealous of his own son who was rising to power, and so he got rid of him. And that's Goya's depiction of that mythology. Another painting, The Witch's Sabbath. This one actually was painted by Goya. This is one of the dark paintings, so it is very dark. It is very black. It's The Witch's Sabbath. You can almost see a swirling motion when you're looking at this painting. And they say that if you looked at it, the actual painting by candlelight, it would appear that, that there's movement and that the whites and the grays and the blacks are kind of blurring in and out of each other because of the eeriness of the painting. So Goya was apparently ill while he was painting these and very disturbed. But some people look at this as genius because, again, if it's watched or looked at under candlelight, it really does appear to be moving. So pretty incredible works by Francisco de Goya. Okay, and to end our presentation, one more of his typical portrait paintings, The Family of Charles IV. But even still, kind of an interesting painting because apparently the king and the queen were not very handsome people, but they were very elegant, as you can tell from their clothing. And, if you see the faces, yeah, not beautiful. There was one pretty one. All right, this princess over here was known as the prettier and nicer one, actually, holding her baby. This one, the son, the prince, was betrothed, but at this point, nobody knew exactly to whom. So when Goya was commissioned to do the painting, he included his future wife, but he has her turning away from the canvas so that you can't really tell who she is yet, because he wasn't going to reveal it, in his painting. And if you could see better, this woman in the background is one of the relatives, and she has a very large birthmark on her face that Goya actually included. So that's one of the things about Goya. Like we said, he almost used his paintings like pictures, like photos. So he didn't really change the appearances of people. Some of the other portrait painters of the time were known to make people look a little prettier or a little more handsome or a little less chubby, but Goya pretty much painted what he saw. Except that, when Charles saw this painting, he really very much appreciated the elegance of the painting. He felt that they all looked very aristocratic, and so he approved of it. So anyway, that's the end of our little conversation about Francisco de Goya. So you have this presentation on using the preterite tense. Please use it to review. Okay, gracias. Ciao.